Hi, welcome back to part 2 of neuroscience. Just to review, the communication between neurons happens between the gap that separates the axon terminals from the sending neuron from the receiving dendrites on the receiving neuron. So the gap that separates the two neurons is called the synapse, also called the synaptic gap or the synaptic cleft. So here's what you need to remember about how neurons communicate. Neurons communicate within the individual neuron via an electrical signal. Once that electrical signal reaches the end of the neuron and pushes towards the axon terminals and causes the terminal buttons to open and release chemicals called neurotransmitters, the neurotransmitters initiate a chemical communication process between neurons. So in this way, the communication within and between neurons is both electrical and chemical. Take a moment to study this graphic of the neuron communication. Now let's talk about those chemicals that float between neurons across the synaptic gap. Remember that action potential causes the terminal vesicles to open. Once the vesicles are open, the neurotransmitters are released into the synapse. And remember, these neurotransmitters are essentially chemicals. The neurotransmitters lock onto receptor molecules on the postsynaptic membrane or the receiving neuron. The neurotransmitters communicate both excitatory or inhibitory messages. An excitatory message increases the likelihood that the postsynaptic neuron or the receiving neuron will fire. The inhibitory message decreases the likelihood that the postsynaptic or receiving neuron will fire. The neurotransmitter molecules, those chemicals, have specific shapes, and the receptor sites on the receiving neurons also have corresponding specific shapes, so that only specific neurotransmitters can fit into their designated receptor sites. So here you see on the right hand an acetylcholine neurotransmitter, that's the pink blob you see on the right. That cannot fit into the receptor site for the norepinephrine, which is on the left. When the neurotransmitter binds to the receptor sites, the ions enter. So some drugs are shaped like neurotransmitters. Some drugs are not. Some drugs are what we would call antagonists, and these poorly fit the receptor site, and they block the actual transmission of the body's own neurotransmitter. For example, beta blockers block the body's stress hormones. Drugs that resemble the original neurotransmitter are called agonists. And these fit the receptor site fairly well, and they mimic or imitate or act like the neurotransmitter. If a neurotransmitter does not make it across the synaptic gap and does not bind to the receptor site, it is reabsorbed by the sending neuron in a process called reuptake. Now let's look at different types of neurotransmitters or chemicals that communicate between neurons. There's acetylcholine, dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, GABA. You also have a class of endorphins. So let's look at acetylcholine first. Essentially, acetylcholine stimulates muscles to contract. Acetylcholine is also important in memory functioning, learning, and overall general intelligence. So acetylcholine is found in neuromuscular junctions. We can have disruptions of acetylcholine functions. So it's possible that an antagonist, remember, it's a chemical that blocks the receptor sites so that the neurotransmitter cannot communicate. Curare is an example of an antagonist that blocks the acetylcholine receptors. Because the receptor sites are blocked, paralysis results. Nerve gas and black widow venom act like agonists. Remember, agonists imitate or mimic a neurotransmitter. So nerve gases and black widow venom attach to the receptor sites and results in too much acetylcholine, causing severe muscle spasms and possibly death. Nicotine also acts as an agonist because it can artificially stimulate skeletal muscles, leading to slight trembling movements. Some other uses of acetylcholine. Botulin, an extremely lethal substance produced by bacteria, is an antagonist because it blocks the release of acetylcholine from motor neurons, causing muscle paralysis. We all know that Botox is a form of botulin that is used to eliminate facial wrinkles through injections of minute amounts of this substance, preventing the motor neurons from activating that eventually cause wrinkles. Alzheimer's disease is characterized by a deterioration in memory, reasoning, and language skills. Symptoms of Alzheimer's disease are thought to be due to a loss of acetylcholine in the brains of affected individuals. Now let's look at dopamine. To introduce the importance of dopamine in brain functioning, I'd like for you to watch a clip of the movie Awakenings. So, Awakenings is a 1990 film based on Oliver Sacks' 1973 memoir called Awakenings. It tells the true story of how Dr. Sacks, who's portrayed by Robin Williams, in 1969 discovered the beneficial effects of a new drug called L-Dopa. He administered it to individuals who were catatonic. The patients were awakened after decades of being catatonic. So with this, L-Dopa was given to Parkinson's patients until their symptoms improved. Dr. Sacks thought that giving more L-Dopa would cure them of their muscle spasms. However, he found that the more L-Dopa he gave them, the more they began to develop psychotic symptoms. Some Parkinson's patients actually began to develop hallucinations and then became schizophrenic. So Dr. Sacks' discovery of the importance of L-Dopa, a synthetic form of dopamine, explained the impact of dopamine in Parkinson's disease, but it also illuminated how we learned that dopamine is involved in schizophrenia as well. So, dopamine is involved in movement, attention, learning, and pleasurable sensations. In Parkinson's disease, this results from the loss of dopamine-producing neurons. Remember, symptoms include difficulty starting and stopping movements, tremors, stoop posture, rigidity, and poor balance. Treatments for Parkinson's disease include taking L-Dopa, a synthetic form of dopamine. However, more promising research is in the area of transplanting fetal dopamine-producing substantia nigra cells into the brain of the Parkinson's patient. Also, adrenal gland transplants have been shown to be effective, and electrical stimulation of the thalamus. What we recognize is that because of the blood-brain barrier, it's very difficult to completely mitigate symptoms of Parkinson's disease by ingesting synthetic dopamine. Better yet would be for the brain to begin to produce its own dopamine again. And that's the reasoning behind the new cutting-edge research into Parkinson's disease. Michael J. Fox is an actor that you all probably know, suffers from Parkinson's disease, and is active in promoting novel research. So dopamine. Parkinson's is caused by a loss of dopamine-producing neurons. Too much dopamine is involved in schizophrenia. Serotonin. Serotonin is involved in sleep, moods, and emotional states. Prozac works by keeping serotonin in the synapse longer, giving it more time to exert an effect. Serotonin is called a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Essentially, sometimes our bodies are too stingy and don't allow serotonin to be used effectively. And what SSRI does is it prevents serotonin from being reabsorbed, so the body can avail itself to its benefits for a longer period of time. Norepinephrine assists in the body's response to danger or threat. It is implicated in the fight or flight response. It's also involved in learning and memory retrieval, as well as depression. Endorphins. Endorphins reduce the perception of pain. They are our body's natural neurotransmitters linked to pain control and pleasure. Morphine and codeine work on the endorphin receptors, and they act as agonists. However, when we flood our body with opiate drugs, the body often stops producing its own natural opiates, which is why it is so difficult for individuals who abuse these drugs to no longer be addicted. The body is in a deficit position, which makes the withdrawal symptoms significantly challenging to accommodate. Endorphins are involved in the healing effects of acupuncture, as well as they're responsible for that feeling of pleasure known as runner's high after a long run. GABA is a neurotransmitter that is involved in the inhibition of brain activity. It balances excitatory messages. Interesting to note is that there is a gut-brain link to GABA. For example, researchers have recently discovered that certain high-quality cheeses that have been aged for a long period of time have shown to send brain signals so that the brain increases production of GABA. GABA usually communicates inhibitory messages to other neurons, reducing brain anxiety. Therefore, anti-anxiety drugs work by increasing GABA in the brain. So too little GABA leads to seizures. Valium increases GABA activity. Alcohol increases GABA activity. However, too much GABA reduces the alertness level so much that it impairs learning. So in summary, we looked at the structure of neurons, action potentials, synapses, neurotransmitters, receptors and ions, agonists and antagonists. So this concludes my presentation on neuroscience. Next time we will begin talking about the brain.